Hey guys, today I want to do something a little different. After watching a few videos by other YouTubers criticizing World of Warcraft for its lack of content, I felt a strong urge to shout into the void what I hope is mostly constructive criticism regarding the game's current state. To put it simply, I think WoW needs more casual content, but what I mean by that probably isn't what most people expect when they hear the word casual. I think the three pillars of modern WoW that have been taking shape since MoP have just about taken their final form. Blizzard seems committed to bringing Mythic Plus dungeons, raids, and PvP more in line with one another. And with the addition of Valor points in the 0.5 patch, I think they're closer than ever to establishing them as the game's dominant attractions. A good portion of the player base has already grown accustomed and even content running the same maps and killing the same bosses for months, even years on end. And this has been enough to keep the game on life support, even in some of its worst content droughts. Remember how long Siege of Orgrimmar lasted? How about Hellfire Citadel? Say what you will, but for better or worse, they get a lot of mileage out of their instanced content, and there's not too much wrong with that. The formula works, but that just can't be all the game offers. Gameplay loops make sense in practice until they go too far, and even though the worst of it died with BFA, it's worth looking at what the last patch of BFA did wrong in terms of gameplay, and how many of these mistakes continue in Shadowlands. On paper, the 8.3 Visions of N'Zoth patch gave us a clear loop of weekly gameplay. Every week you'd do the weekly and bi-weekly invasions, you'd get your special currency to enter visions, and then you'd do those visions to earn corrupted gear or cloak upgrades that you needed to raid and do dungeons. It was a simple loop that kept you logged in throughout the week. But from my perspective, it didn't work because none of the individual activities felt engaging or fun. They felt like chores. The Vale and Oldham invasions felt like cheaply made theme parks, crammed with enough enemies to disguise a few bonus objectives and a named NPC you had to kill before you moved on. The progress bar in the corner of my screen made it impossible not to think about the goal, so all that seemed to matter was finding things that gave the most percentage, or the most currency. Once the bar was full and the main invasion was complete, none of the activities seemed to encourage you to stick around. Then you had horrific visions. By their timed nature, they felt like they wanted you to hurry through them, and they punished you unnecessarily every time you got lost or made a mistake. Even when you succeeded, the quality of rewards diminished with each run, giving you fewer and fewer reasons to replay the content until the next reset. So a good week of visions and the whole gameplay loop started to look like just 20 minutes doing invasions, 20 minutes doing the highest reward version of the visions, and then the rest of the week depended on how much you wanted to spam mythic keystones and raid Nyalotha over and over. What's missing both then and now, at least from my perspective, is long-form casual gameplay content that's completely optional. To be clear, what I mean when I say casual is something that's completely divorced from the item-level power climb that we use to measure progress in a season of competitive play. And by long form, I mean something that we can play for anywhere from a few minutes to many hours at a time, with diverse rewards that we can work towards at our own pace. In short, it's things that make us want to spend time playing this game, and for rewards that we want but don't necessarily feel pressured to work for. Considering that Torghast was one of the most exciting aspects of Shadowlands throughout the early beta, it was a crushing disappointment to watch it slowly cut down and repackaged as some weekly chore. I think it's worth asking why people seem to love it enough to run hours and hours of it then, but not enough to engage with it as much in the live game. I think the problem with the final product is a compound of a few things. Repetitive gameplay with uninteresting enemies, still too much anima power RNG, a short duration that prevents player immersion, and an uninspired reward system. Let's be honest, Soul Ash is the only serious reward from Torghast, and since it's time-gated by a weekly lockout limiting access to higher ranks of legendaries, it really starts to feel like a 30-minute chore that you have to do each week if you want to stay on track. Sure, I can run just as much Torghast as I want, but if I'm done getting rewards for the week after just half an hour, why would I run more? The content in the game should be inviting us to play more, to stay longer, not shoo us away. I think the solution, at least for Torghast, is obvious. Timegate the act of turning Soul Ash into legendary upgrades, but don't timegate the gameplay grind that gets you the Ash. For example, let's say the 5250 Soul Ash needed to make a rank 4 legendary from scratch takes, let's say, 4 hours total of grinding Torghast when you add it all up. Well, what if you could choose how you split that up? Maybe you want to spend 2 hours grinding one day, and another 2 hours a week or two later. Maybe you want to take a week or a month-long break in between grinds, or piecemeal it out by running a few floors on a low layer once a day. All of these choices should be supported in a fair way that respects but doesn't micromanage our time and effort. Just look at Twisting Corridors. The only serious reward was the Maw mount, and if you wanted it, you were going to put in the work. Some people worked on it one layer at a time, putting in a bit of time once a week or whenever they ran out of other things to do. Others waited months so they'd be better geared. Then you had another category of people who did what I did and grinded out all 8 layers back to back on the afternoon that it came out. It took me about 6 hours in all, but there was a point about an hour into it that I started to feel genuinely immersed in the content, to the point that I allowed myself to forget about the rewards and just enjoy myself. Nothing was pressuring me to do it at a certain pace or over a few weeks. It was completely dictated by my own choice. You see a lot of this kind of casual gameplay in other older game areas. Timbermaw Hold Rep in Classic was a simple grind with multiple locations in Fellwood and Winterspring, where you could farm kills and gather rep items. During Wrath and Cataclysm, we had faction-specific tabards we could put on and then spam random dungeon queues to grind rep. There was no daily or weekly limit to how much we could do. Then you had Xiaohao Rep on Timeless Isle, which let you choose whether you wanted to farm weaker mobs for a smaller amount of rep, tougher elites near the world boss for about 5 times the rep, or just actively hunt for events and rare spawns around the island for hours on end. Back then a lot of us played a little bit of everything the island had to offer, and spending hours out there each day became the norm. It didn't disrespect our time or tell us to come back next week instead. This is the kind of self-paced grinding I wanted from zones like Nazjatar and the N'Zoth invasions, that I hoped we would get from Shadowlands. Then you have the closest thing to Horrific Visions, the Deaths of Chromie scenario during Legion. It was locked behind a simple quest line and, mostly separate from the rest of the game, a speed run with permanent upgrades that you got more and more of with each attempt. Learning some of these upgrades required 1 to 5 days of waiting for research, but earning the rep needed to access the upgrades could be done at any pace for however long, however many attempts you wanted. Eventually you could clear all the objectives within the time limit, and the rewards were purely casual, like a title and a transmog set. Sadly, in Shadowlands, reputations and casual content have by far the least to offer of all expansions. If you want to farm rep with the Shadowlands faction, nearly everything is time-gated. You might get lucky and have a daily calling for the zone you want rep with, in which case you'll spend about 5 to 10 minutes and earn 1500 rep. But what if you want more? At best you might have 6 world quests left on the map, each for a much smaller amount of rep, but each of them are short, specific chores that don't even bother to hold your attention since they're easy and over so quickly. The ones that give anima start to feel like an uncomfortable bribe, and the ones that don't feel almost pointless. And once you're done with those, there's really not much else. You have to wait for the next round of world quests a few hours later, which might not even spawn where you want them to, or at worst, leave and come back the next day. It takes weeks to get exalted with a Shadowlands faction, but it only adds up to a few hours of actual gameplay. The rest is just waiting, and that's not right. That's why Paragon caches from every 10,000 rep after exalted feel so out of place, because they're incentivizing this long-term, seemingly endless grind without providing the gameplay for it, especially when the only potential rewards are cosmetic, like mounts, toys, and pets. So with great disappointment, we add reputations to the list of activities that have been micromanaged and reshaped into these short bursts of daily and weekly chores. It's a shame, really, because Shadowlands zones looked really impressive until I found out how little I'd actually be doing in them. Despite all of these examples of casual activities that work or don't work, I won't pretend that time gating is the only problem. Oftentimes there are too few things to do, and even fewer reasons to do them. Think about it. We're stuck running one raid for months at a time, and the same 8 to 10 dungeons for just about 2 years straight. If they introduced new time-walking raids or gave the existing ones more attention, better tuning, and more exciting rewards. Less competitive players and their guilds could take a night or even a week off from the main raid and try out the alternative. While we're at it, let's put the world back in World of Warcraft. Instead of spending the rest of the expansion in Shadowlands zones we're already bored of, why don't we add a few reasons to revisit the rest of the world? If time-walking events were expanded to fold in more than just dungeons and raids, these holidays could bring old expansions back to life for a whole week. They could incentivize us to go back to Outland, to Northrend, Pandaria, and others by giving time-warped badges and even Shadowlands anima for completing old quest lines. Sure, funneling everyone to the same place causes problems, just look at the classic launch experience, but you could adjust NPC spawn rates and fix obvious bottlenecks so that nobody gets stuck waiting in line. You could make it so that old escort quests can be picked up even after someone else starts them, and events like Ring of Blood and Amphitheater of Anguish could be revamped to be more like the Outdoor Theater of Pain in Maldraxxus, with the bosses spawning automatically in a rotation. As for incentives, fair is fair. If they can give me 200 anima for running a 2-minute lap in Maldraxxus, they can give me 1,000 anima for finishing a storyline in Northrend during Wrath time walking. Almost everything bought with anima is cosmetic anyways. Who does this hurt? Time walking is such an attractive option for bringing in casual gameplay because there's so much variety. What if you could farm time-warped badges from all kinds of time walking activities, and then spend them on anything from pets and toys to old mounts like Invincible or even the rare collectibles from places like Timeless Isle? Now we have to talk about the gameplay itself. Because so much of the game is combat-oriented, how much we enjoy the content usually depends on, or is at least related to, how geared we are, and that doesn't need to be the case. Even though the weekly reward system disagrees, Torghast brought us the concept of this open-ended mega-dungeon, a solo or group instance with an auto-generated randomized layout. For a while during the early beta, there was an idea that Torghast would have an endless mode, that you could just keep climbing until you couldn't anymore. Like the endless mode of Proving Grounds, but unconfined by a single room. 90% of Torghast revolves around fighting the same uninteresting mobs over and over, and even though anima powers help liven up the experience, I feel like it's overlooking a huge opportunity to design this kind of instanced content in different styles. The way I imagine it, you could take the technology used to create Torghast's vast randomized layouts and create new labyrinthine mega instances using indoor and underground interiors from the game's past. We could have something like Twisting Corridors, but instead of combat, it would emphasize gathering or exploration. An herbalist might enter a corridors-sized instance with the visual style of Moradon to explore the massive layout while gathering herbs. You could spice up the gameplay by introducing environmental threats like neutral herbivores or some kind of rot so that you'd have to perform triage by getting to the nodes before they're destroyed. A miner could find themselves in an underground Nerubian complex mining serenite while burning spider webs and avoiding something like a sanity loss mechanic. A skinner could carefully avoid a larger predator while skinning their leftover prey, and archaeologists could explore trap-filled tombs for fragments to work on their projects. There's a lot of thematic possibility here. In terms of environments, you could get really creative with the challenges. Some areas could test your ability to traverse a space, such as an underwater portion of a sunken ruins map with hidden air pockets to help you survive. I want to stress that if they made content like this that could keep us busy for hours, it'd be in everyone's best interest that it be a weekly or even a monthly lockout or longer. Then make it so that we can leave whenever we want and pick up right where we left off when we come back. From underground dwarven cities and sunken night elf ruins to Karaji hives and troll catacombs, there's so many different interior themes to work with. Again, it's stuff like this that puts the world back in World of Warcraft, and with the right lore crumbs, the environments could tell their own stories in a way that modern WoW seems reluctant to do. Just as Torghast sells the fantasy of killing the jailer's minions and freeing trapped souls, these exploratory mega-dungeons could provide the simple gameplay of fighting and maneuvering through a mystery space while hunting for collectibles and uncovering lore items. At the end there could be a final puzzle or a minigame, maybe an unconventional boss fight or an escape sequence to give the run a proper climax. Anything's possible because this is the kind of content where they can experiment freely. I think it's important that whenever you have a gameplay grind that's combat or exploration oriented, you have to have ways of breaking up the routine. In Torghast, they do this in a few different ways. There are trap floors with almost no combat, but instead a bunch of environmental hazards. There are floors that bake in elements of traversal and small tasks like freeing souls. There are rewarding puzzles like rune-locked chests and unlockable side rooms, and every third floor gives you a vendor to buy additional powers. Even the boss floors give us variety. Minigames have always been helpful to break up the gameplay routine. World quests are the best example of this. Sometimes instead of a regular combat world quest, you'll have a collection quest, or a minigame like the Bejeweled knockoff in Nazjatar, or that Flappy Bird quest in Bastion. You've got bombing runs, stealth assassinations, vehicle combat with destructible buildings. I could go on and on. What's disappointing is that some of the most entertaining minigames appear once or twice in-game and that's it. Don't get me wrong, not everyone enjoys these minigames. At least once per expansion, it seems, they come up with something really terrible, something that isn't fun at all or that doesn't work properly. That lily pad bounce quest that we first saw in Nazjatar and now in Bastion can glitch and drop you straight through a lily pad. And that makes what should have been a simple and satisfying minigame a real pain in the ass sometimes. Especially when it appears on the map fairly often. All I'm suggesting is that Blizzard take time and review every minigame they've ever introduced, and find a way to reintroduce fan favorites instead of sticking to the same 1 or 3 minigames for a whole expansion. Imagine if Torghast had more than just the rune puzzles, but instead incorporated reskinned versions of the Tortolan matching game or the Bejeweled parody. Maybe those weren't the best examples of fun, but I hope you get my point. Just don't bring back the calligraphy quests. I hated them when they were a one-time quest in Azuna, and I really hated them when I had to do it multiple times a week in BFA. I think it's time we re-elevate crafting professions and make them a proper path to gearing. In the past, resource grinding was a way to gear up for PvE and PvP content. You had 2 and 3 piece sets or standalone pieces, each with competitive enough stat budgets to rival early raid gear. And you'd farm for hours to collect the rare drops needed to make them, usually from a bunch of different overworld locations. Each piece felt like a quest in its own right, and that's how a lot of casual players chose to spend their time. Even though there was time gating whenever a critical part of the recipe could only be made once every few days, the game let you farm everything else you needed at any pace you liked. The reward itself was time gated, not the hard work and the gameplay. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's exactly how I said I want Torghast and Soul Ash to be. I don't think there's anything wrong with making crafting professions a valid method of improving our gear over the course of a tier. People always get anxious at the thought of participation trophies and welfare gear, but excessive gatekeeping when it comes to competitive rewards from casual content serves no one. All they have to do is time gate our ability to upgrade armor or equip additional pieces, so that crafting never outpaces the rate of gearing through dungeons, raid, and PvP. I also think it's important that they make the most important mats bind on pickup, or bind on account even, so we always have to put the work in instead of just buying everything. I think they'd have to stop or slow down upgrades dramatically after heroic raid level to keep things fair to the competitive crowd, but I think everyone deserves to feel rewarded for their time spent in-game over the course of a season, especially considering that better crafted gear could help casual players make the transition to harder content more easily. I'm not big on PvP, so I'll keep this part brief. War mode features like supply drops and bounties that generated a ton of activity in BFA still haven't been implemented in older zones, and I think the game suffers for it. Even if it's only during time walking weeks, I think it's important to build on these successes. Put the world back in world PvP by giving us activities to do outside the decade-old maps like Isle of Conquest, or even older ones like Warsong Gulch and Alterac Valley. I don't really enjoy the pressure of rated PvP or even casual battlegrounds, but I sunk a lot of hours into waiting for supply drops and killing assassins in War Mode Nazjatar to get honor gear on my alts, because it was a fun and engaging time sink. Even the faction incursions on Kultiris and Zandalar showed us that world PvP happens whenever you force both factions into the same play space, so why not capitalize on that? Next, you have world bosses.
As is the theme with most outdoor content in modern WoW, world bosses have become these 40-man loot pinatas with so few mechanics that we might as well be hitting a training dummy. Compare that to world bosses during Mists of Pandaria, where most of the time, you had to at least acknowledge the abilities being thrown at you if you wanted to live. Remember Undasta trashing multiple full raid groups at once? Okay, yeah, that probably was too much, but at least the fights were exciting until we outgeared them. Having to form a group with the people present made me feel like an active participant in an event, and I was invested in the fight because it wasn't always a guaranteed loot giveaway. While we're still on the topic of world content, I think it's worth revisiting player housing, but as a purely optional side project. For the individual player, imagine a garrison but in a zone of your choosing. Less of a fortress and more of a home or a retreat in a cozy corner of the world. Each zone from Ashenvale to Icecrown could have a handful of potential plots at various locations, and you could start with a simple lodge with a unique hearthstone before upgrading it into an inn. The idea is that you'd unlock different architectural styles through exploration and questing, from human lodges and dwarven inns to Nightborn homes and Vrykul dwellings. You could customize it, really make it personal, and unlock features like a menagerie to display your favorite pets and mounts, a personal flight point, a trader's post for exchanging one profession material for another, and even a telemancy network like the one in Suramar. Think of all the best features of garrisons, outdoor zones like Suramar, and even Covenant features like the travel network and Anima Conductor. Then imagine them on a smaller scale. You could invite guest NPCs to your lodge and earn favor with them in the style of friendships from Halfhill and Pandaria. Or you could attract challengers to fight solo or with a group similar to Brawler's Guild, or to the Garrison Greater Invasion bosses. You could even invite a friend to make your house their home for a few days, which could benefit new players and friends alike if it came with temporary bonuses, or if your house was close to something they needed to farm. If we're talking about player housing, I feel like we also need to talk about guild housing. In my mind, I see this being a feature for capital cities only, where your guild leader picks a city to base your guild in, something they can change after a reasonable amount of time, like once every 30 days. It could have many of the same features as individual player housing, but on a bigger scale, and I think it could include elements like the mine, herb garden, and fishing shack, each stocked with gathering nodes depending on how much the guild has gathered recently. All mats gathered from these buildings would go directly into the guild bank in a special tab, and they'd be made bind on pickup once withdrawn, so they'd be guaranteed to serve the guild's crafting needs. As for the portal network feature, guild dungeon and raid progress could unlock portals close to these instances. You could unlock and import features from past expansions like mission tables and troop recruiters. And you could build monuments to show off guild achievements to visitors, anything from a statue or a sculpture to something more like Nefarian's head hanging from a spike. Here's where we have to talk about rewards, because rewards are inextricably linked to not just the replayability of content, but to our own sense of agency regarding why and what content we play. There are hundreds of mounts, pets, toys, and other collectibles from past expansions, and if we want them, a lot of the time we're forced to participate in arbitrarily lengthy grinds for an extremely rare drop. For a lot of these, the content is so low level that it doesn't even offer a challenge, and after a while it stops feeling like gameplay at all. But what if we could choose from a selection of near infinitely replayable activities like Torghast, or those exploration mega-dungeons that I described? Even simpler, why don't they introduce a currency awarded by most activities that we can redeem for anything? This could be mounts, appearances, recolors, and odd collectibles. You name it. And that's only mentioning existing possibilities for rewards. If you look at Shadowlands, one of the best features at launch was the expansion of customization options for all the races. Why should it stop there? For years there has been talk of expanding on existing classes and folding in RP customization. Warlocks got their Fellfire recolor. What if we could earn and discover customization to our class abilities the way that they did? Druids could take on a fiery theme based on their Firelands counterparts. Scarlet Raven Priests could inspire a reskinned animation based on existing NPC spells. Shaman could lean hard into one element over the others. Mages and Warlocks could tap into some deathly green Necromancer flair. and classes like warriors, hunters, and demon hunters could style their abilities like a warden. Most of the colors, animations, and icons for this stuff already exist. You could take inspiration from Outland Blood Mages, runecasters from Northrend, and half-humanoid shapeshifts like the bosses in Zulaman for druids. Even Covenant abilities could get a makeover. I've said this from the start, that an easy solution to most of the Covenant choice problems would have been to give us the abilities as a final talent row, but have them all reskinned to match the aesthetic of our chosen Covenant. We're Mawwalkers, right? Messing around in all the Shadowlands? Mediating things between the Covenants? Story-wise, wouldn't it make sense that we borrow techniques from others? And isn't the theme of patch 9.1 that the Covenants are coming together? Make me earn it if you want, that's fine. I just don't see why my white anima-colored Spear of Bastion couldn't just as easily be a death green Spear of Maldraxxus. What's meaningful choice without a little freedom? I'd love to unlock other races' heritage armor for my main, even if it takes tens of hours of gameplay working for those factions. To go back to the idea of player housing, what about the Garrison music player that we haven't seen since WoD? This game has a selfie camera. It's not a stretch to imagine Chromie giving us an MP3 player. Did you know that the full unreleased soundtrack for every expansion put together has a runtime of over 100 hours? You could add hundreds of collectible music rolls and have us find them in hidden places that they play, like a massive community scavenger hunt or a secret finding project. Considering that WoW is behind a lot of other MMOs in its breadth of customization, I just think it's time they explore these possibilities for cosmetic rewards and customization, especially since most of them are already in-game in one form or another. Did you know there was going to be a Shattrath raid in the middle of Warlords of Draenor? What about the second unused instance portal in Vashtir? Or the shelved War of the Ancients raid in Cataclysm? Not long ago there were people already asking for Classic Plus content to be made based on cut content from the original game. But I don't think we should dismiss the possibility entirely for retail either. If we look at how past expansions pulled it off, you'll see that shoehorning in parts of WoW history and side stories is easier than it sounds. BC and Wrath both had an ongoing side story of the infinite dragonflight messing around in the past. Each time we intervened, the original timeline was restored. That's to say we don't have to retcon anything, just let us participate in the same way that Mists of Pandaria scenarios gave us entry-level instanced content for casual and semi-competitive play. Speaking of lore, I think scenarios were excellent showcases for important moments like the bombing of Theramore, the assassination attempt on Vol'jin, and the discovery of an old god's heart under the veil in Pandaria. I'd love to see similar scenarios made, but with the visual quality of modern WoW. And there are so many possibilities to turn major events from Warcraft history into story content. They could flesh out the Thunder King as a better villain by showing us his greatest hits that we've only read about, such as when he defeated Ra-Den and took the Titan's power, or his first defeat in Death trying to seize the Halls of Origination in Uldum. We could witness events like the destruction of Shattrath by the Horde, Thorm's betrayal by Loken, and the Titan's war with the Black Empire. They could even use these things as promotional content leading up to the release of new time-walking raids. And while we're at it, why not just give us back the MoP and WoD legendary quest lines? They set up so much of the lore and the connective tissue between expansions, and replays really just aren't the same without them. Before I wrap this up, I really want to touch on the role of multimedia content in shaping the Warcraft story, which earns a lot of criticism for shotgunning some of its most important lore all over their website, the YouTube channel, promotional material, and in full-length books instead of making a proper in-game storyline about it. Remember how we eventually unlocked the Warbringer cinematics for Jaina, Ashara, and Sylvanas as we quested through BFA? Well, what if we could earn or unlock other cinematics and lore shorts, even small excerpts from the books like Chronicle? There were patch teasers like Fury of the Sunwell, Rage of the Firelands, and the Thunder King that were story cinematics in their own right. The Siege of Orgrimmar trailer had an opening sequence that impressed me way more than the ending cinematic from the raid itself. And it wasn't even the first or last time that a patch trailer did that. You've also got the Burdens of Shauhouse shorts that introduced the Pandaren lore at a time when Mists of Pandaria still seemed disconnected from the main story. You had the Lord of War series, which built up the Warlords of Draenor themselves. and the Harbinger series that established Khadgar, Illidan, and Gul'dan as major players going into Legion. There's even new lore shorts still being released for Burning Crusade Classic that could be inserted into quest lines or made discoverable as collectibles in-game. All of these things together could help elevate the storytelling for new players and give returning players a little treat for revisiting old content. All of this is meant to say that Warcraft is full of content and forms of gameplay that have attracted players for over 15 years. Many of them are content running the same raids for 6 months straight, the same dungeons for 2 years, and many of the same PvP maps that we've had for over a decade. Dungeons, raids, and PvP in WoW have obviously stood the test of time, so I think it's time to shift focus and bring up the other side, innovating on casual content in a way that deepens our immersion every time we log in to play. Don't give us cheap carrot-and-stick objectives or short bursts of lackluster gameplay. Give us long-form, repeatable content with a reward system we can engage with however we choose. Offer us customization options where you can, and return to the RPG elements that helped past expansions succeed. I know it's a small audience out there, but if you have any ideas of your own, feel free to share them in the comments section. I've got a special attachment to WoW because I've played on and off since vanilla, and I'm always interested in the perspectives of people who have come into the game at different points in its history. For now, I've been Luno, and this has been my Shout into the Void. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.